Hi, this is Phil Newman from Longevity.Technology, and we're at the Rejuvenation Startup Summit in Berlin, and I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Eric Verdin. Eric.
Good to see you again, Phil.
Great to see you, Eric, and we've just had a fascinating presentation from you on your thoughts about aging clocks and the implications of some new studies that you've been doing. So fascinated to know a little bit more about that, because this is fundamental to our industry, isn't it?
Yeah, I think everyone recognizes that the identification of predictable, validated biomarker is going to be a bottleneck in terms of, let's say we discover drugs that actually that we think slow down aging. We're going to have to prove it not only in mice, but in humans. And no one is prepared or ready to do a 30-year clinical trials in humans. So therefore, the critical need for characterizing, identifying, and defining, validating biomarkers of aging. Think about the same thing as measuring your cholesterol. The ability to measure cholesterol level created a whole $20 billion industry of statins, where you take a drug, it lowers your cholesterol, and you know by inference that this is likely to be protective against heart disease. So this is the same thing we're doing in the aging field, trying to study, identify these markers, and really understand them better than what we do today.
Absolutely, and of course, we're all fans of understanding our chronological and biological age and whether there's differences between those. But you've presented today some facts that are questioning the way that we look at it currently in the industry, and I'd be really interested to understand about how you've looked at that scientifically and how that compared to what's in the market at the moment.
Yeah, so the tissue that we have the most easily access to in terms of measuring biological age is the blood. And as an immunologist, it's always sort of bothered me and worried me that when you look at the blood, this is not a sort of a uniform compartment. There are more than 60 different cell types in the blood. And importantly, we know some of these cells actually fluctuate up and down. And so when you are, for example, using a technique like the methylation clock, the epigenetic clocks that are looking at these little dinucleotide CPG in the genome, in the DNA as markers of aging, you are looking at a mixture of many different cells. And the question, so under some conditions you see a line, so it progresses along with aging. The worry that we had is, could change in the composition of relative proportion of different cells in the blood actually yield some apparent change of aging, which would actually be not truly aging, but would be simply a change in your blood composition. Mm-hmm. And so we tested this by isolating a subset of a blood cells called CD8 T cells. They're lymphocytes, they help you fight infection. And what we found is that there are at least 5 different subsets that we can isolate and purify. And when you do this and you apply the so-called methylation clock, Horvath clock, and all of the others, we find differences in age within these different subtypes that can be as high as 25 years. So which means that if the cell that has a much lower age becomes more prevalent, this would give you the impression that you're actually being rejuvenated.
Right.
What it would all mean is not that you're rejuvenated, but essentially that you are increasing that proportion of the cell.
Okay.
Now, the other thing we found, which is equally important, is that, so that means there's a link between this epigenetic clock and cell differentiation. That's number one. Number two, we found that when you take an identical population of cells, let's say a naive CD8 T cells, which is a subset of T cells, and you look in people of different ages, we still see a trace associated with aging using the epigenetic clock. And so that tells you that the current clock that we're using are a mixture of 2 different things, a true age, and the other one is something linked to cell differentiation. And so what we did based on this is to generate a new clock, or actually 2 new clocks. One that would be looking at differentiation, and the other one associated with aging, and the other one looking purely at an intrinsic aging. Mm-hmm. This might be a little complicated. The major point that I think your listeners can take home is the idea that the clocks that we have right now are great tools. They really have great predictive value, but they are a compound of 2 different clocks. Mm-hmm. And I think we didn't know this before, we know it now. Now that we know it, I think this will allow us to separate it in 2 different clocks that will teach us different things. And these two different clocks are both related to aging. So, I mean, I don't want to be saying that this is not related to aging, but via different mechanisms. And so what this will allow us to do in the future is to refine our analysis and maybe really, have better tools, basically. This is the stage at which we are right now.
And you did show in one of your charts a comparison between some of the existing clocks as a baseline to understand their accuracy, but likewise their accuracy to what you've discovered in your new clock effectively. So how do you feel that this differentiates between what's in the market now and where you're going to be proposing to take this research?
Yeah. Well, there are multiple ways to look at this. Some of the clocks are in the market right now. You and I can go and buy one and test it. I don't want to be dismissive because there's some value, but many of those are more akin to gadgets than they are to true medical tools. Mm-hmm. And so to get to the next level, which is really defining a medical tool that doctors are going to look at and say, this is true, this is validated, I can really, if I give a medicine and I see a change in my clock, this means that this person is going to live longer. This is the goal. Mm-hmm. The answer is, and I hate to be I'm not a pessimistic here, I'm more a realist, that to get to that stage, medical grade epigenetic clock is going to take a lot more work. And I hope that what we have found will be one step in making these better in the future.
And how would you approach proving that in terms of accuracy as a predictor of death, or obviously as a calculator of age or some of the aging diseases? How would you do that over a shorter period of time? We can't likewise wait 30 years for you to bring out your variation of these clocks.
Yes.
So how would you test that?
Well, the work is ongoing. We're really lucky. There are enormous amounts of data sets that are available. People in my lab, in particular, Alan Tumusiak, who is responsible for this new clock, is working day and night to try to, test every samples that we can probably get our hands on and try to validate it. At some point, it will have to go to the clinic. Another virtue of this clock is that we think it eliminates an aspect of aging that was enmeshed with the other clock before, so you could actually not look at it. And so we're equally excited by the idea of using this clock as a tool for screening for compounds that would actually revert this. Imagine that you have a clock that has two different mechanisms embedded in it, and you're screening for drugs to revert the clock. Well, you're never going to know which of these two mechanisms you are targeting. And so untangling these two clocks, one from each other, I think is going to increase our understanding and hopefully, give us better tool.
Interesting. So obviously the Buck's a leading institution for a lot of work in aging. So the fact that you're doing this now as a research project at the Buck is fascinating. What's the trajectory now for getting this from the Buck through the phases you need to in terms of testing and then getting it out into the market?
Well, there are multiple phases. One is we need to do a lot more basic work, and this is ongoing in my lab at the Buck. That's number one. Number two, we are considering startups, having a mechanism that would allow us to do some of the things that we've talked about, screening for drugs that actually that are reversing this clock or reversing the other clock. Now we can do this. We could not do this before. So taking, for example, a library of approved drugs and that's the first one we're going to be doing, and asking, okay, are any of the existing drugs today, does rapamycin revert this clock or the other clock? So that's number one. Number two, what's been interesting, and when you sort of disentangle these two clocks, and you look at the CPG, the dinucleotide sites that corresponds to both, you actually see different things.
Right. And
so, whereas before people were looking together and they were saying, there's no biology linked to these CPG because they were an admixture of two different processes. Now that we look at them separately, it seems that they're speaking different languages. They're pointing to different pathways, which I think is going to be really interesting. As you know, we're always looking for new targets in the aging field, new targets to engage, to generate drugs, and so on. We're right at the beginning of this whole field, and I think it's just one small step in terms of gaining a bit deeper understanding of what we are doing.
Yeah, understood. So obviously there are a lot of organisations that are progressing quite actively now with their versions of clocks. In terms of what you've discovered, Eric, do you feel that this is, obviously there's research that you're doing, but how confident are you in what you've found out and how you're going to apply this going forward? It's quite disruptive, I'd say.
It's disruptive in a way that some of what has been said in the past in terms of reversion of aging, I think might be reinterpreted in a different way based on our clock. But I think more than being disruptive, I hope that people would look at it as one more step. Mm-hmm. Science always progresses by making something that you think is very simple, making it very complicated. And the more you study something, the more complicated it gets. But at some point, eventually, it gets simpler. We're right at that stage where we have a partial understanding of the aging process and how to measure it. And I think about this as one small step that will tell us, well, here's this way that we thought we were measuring pure aging, but we're actually measuring two variables in aging. And now we can look at them individually and therefore gain a better understanding. Are they always together? Can these two mechanisms actually run parallel? So there's lots of interesting questions that are going to come out of this.
Great. Well, Eric, always a pleasure to meet you and fascinating projects. So best of luck to you and your colleagues.
Thank you very much for having me.